I'm Rubén Hernández León. I'm a professor of sociology at UCLA and director of the Latin American Institute. And today, this evening, it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to the last presentation of the year for our series on migrant children negotiating educational systems. This is a series that we started this year. It's part of our outreach program coordinated by my colleague Veronica Zavala. And as with other things with the outreach program, this series is aimed at teachers and other professionals who work in school systems and particularly public school systems. The outreach program has an excellent track record organizing workshops and seminars with experts, and once again aim at public school teachers. Today we have the pleasure of welcoming to the series Dr. Betsabé González, who is an independent scholar. She received her PhD in social science at Tec de Monterrey in 2017. She also, after completing her PhD, she conducted a postdoctoral stay at the Center for U.S.-Mexican Studies at UCSD, and subsequently was a researcher at El Colegio de Sonora in Mexico. She has been working on themes and topics related to the experiences of migrant families, migrant children, and school systems in Mexico and in the United States for quite a few years. She's going to tell us a little bit more about her experience. And she continues to teach and organize workshops for teachers, particularly in Mexico. She continues to publish and is very much active with the network of scholars in Mexico and the United States, studying the experiences of children as they not only cross borders, but also cross and participate in different educational systems. So welcome, Betsabé. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation, and we're going to yield the floor to you.
Thank you so much, Ruben. Thank you. Thank you for having me here today, for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to see you and to see everyone. So today I was invited to talk about parents' perspectives on the school experiences of transnational children. This was actually not a challenge, but it was kind of different from what I'm usually teaching and presenting about, because I usually present about children's experiences, children's perspectives on schooling between Mexico and the United States. So it took me a while, to go back and find some information about parents. And that also shows us how there is not a lot of research done specifically with parents of children between the United States and Mexico. Of course, we have talked to them. We go through them in order to be able to talk to children, but in our research focus until now had been with children. So this was very interesting to do, and just like in my mind, try to contrast what children say and what parents say. It was very interesting. Let me see if I'm doing this right. Okay. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background about myself. I am actually a transnational student myself. I grew up in Mexico, and when I was 12 years old, I moved to Cleveland, Tennessee with my parents and my sister. My dad was doing his master's degree in theology. So that was my first interaction and the first time that I was in an American school, that I was learning in English, that I was in an almost all white community in all my life. So since then, I had like a vision of this is not what I would want other children to go through if they come to the US. I didn't have a really nice experience when I was in Cleveland, Tennessee. I was supposed to go into 8th grade, and because of my age, they put me in 6th grade. Also, they put me in a English as a second language program, but it was mostly targeted towards students that were learning, you know, the alphabet and the sounds. And my sister and I, we already knew the alphabet in Spanish, which is very similar to the one in English. So we were just like rewriting the alphabet all the time. So it was not, we didn't learn any English at all. So once the teachers saw that we were not learning anything, they put us right into the classroom, and the transition was very hard for me. I couldn't make any friends. It was difficult to, you know, like get to know the school, get to know, you know, like the culture. So it was hard for me. And at that age, I always kept thinking, okay, well, in 2 years, I'm gonna go back to Mexico. I'm gonna go back to my country. I felt so patriotic back then. And I was like, I'm gonna go back and everything is gonna be okay. And then I came back to Mexico, or I went back to Mexico. I forget that I'm in San Diego right now. I went back to Mexico when I was 14 years old, and my experience in schools was exactly the same as my experience had been in the US. I did not feel at home anymore. I had trouble communicating with other children and with the teachers. It was hard to adjust again. So from that moment on, I knew that I wanted to be a teacher, maybe, that I wanted to help children, you know, like that were going through the same experiences. So in that moment, I thought maybe it was because I didn't speak the language. Maybe it was because I didn't know the culture. I don't know, all these things came to my mind, but I just knew that I didn't want other children to go through that situation as I did. So that's why I went into education when I reached college. So I have a major in child development and learning with teacher licensure. And for my thesis, I was teaching Spanish as a second language in Tennessee, which, well, that's another story. I went back to the US after I said that I wouldn't. So I went to college in Tennessee again. I finished college with my thesis on Spanish as a second language for second graders. Then I went back to Mexico and did my master's in educational psychology. And it was until I went into my PhD that I had like a first encounter with sociology and transnational students and all that. And Ruben knows Dr. Zuniga. You might have heard about him too. That's when I met him, and I thought that someone was watching me all my life when I started reading his papers and his research. I was like, oh my gosh, this is what happened to me. How did I not know about this person before? And luckily, I was able to work with him and do my research, my PhD research with him, and learn about these families, learn about these children, and this is what I'm presenting to you. So in 2012, when I started my PhD, before that, Dr. Zuniga, Dr. Ted Hammond, who was presenting in this series too, and Dr. Juan Sanchez, they had been doing research with children in schools. And they did interviews there, they would talk to them, they would talk to teachers, but that was it. They didn't know what happened to children after that interview. When I started the PhD, I think it was an advantage for me being a woman, also had that I had a major in education, that, I don't know, maybe that I was younger, you know, and children and moms saw me as a teacher too. So it was a transition from just going and interviewing in schools but I was also able to go in the homes of these families. So we started doing this through the Programa Binacional de Educación Migrante, which is like an office in the education department of each state. And Laura Peñalosa, who had been in a conference before with Victor Zúñiga, she heard that it was hard for us as researchers to find these children in schools. So when she became head of this office, she started trying to document every child that came through the Secretaría de Educación Pública, the educational office, who was coming from the US or from other countries. And she started documenting which schools they went to in the state of Morelos. So when I started being a student at Tecnológico de Monterrey, she had just shared this database. Like it was an Excel sheet at first. Now they have like a really nice program, you know, where they type in all the information. But at first it was just an Excel sheet with all the names of the families, the names of the children, the names of their schools in the US, the schools that they were enrolling in Morelos, their birth certificates, their transcripts, etc. So it was like a gold mine for us to find this database and to actually see where these children were going to in Morelos. So in 2012, I started this longitudinal study. And I can say that I followed these families from 2012 until 2020, which is when the pandemic kind of started. And it was multi-site. That meant that I would follow them wherever they would go. So I started in Morelos with 6 families, but sometimes the children or the whole family would move to another state in Mexico. So I would go and visit them in that other state. Sometimes the children would come back to the US. So I would visit them in the US too, in different states in the US. And I will show you a little map in a little bit. Why 6 families? Well, I started I wanted to do 20 families at first. I was very naive as a research student, and I wanted to do 20 families. And yes, there were so many families, but the thing is that some of them, they were coming from really hard situations in the US, and they didn't want someone to go to their house and just start asking questions about them, about their children. So they wouldn't respond. Others, they would say, yes, of course. And then they would just not respond my calls or my emails. And then I also realized that it was a lot of information and a lot of work for my research thesis. So at the end, I stayed with the 6 families that were very open from the beginning. And each of these families had 2 or 3 children. So it was, in the end, it was like 12 children that I was interviewing. The research that I was doing was participant observation, which means that we would go to the town and then do some observation in the school. Then we would go to the houses and spend a couple of days in each house. At the beginning, we wouldn't stay at the houses because they were still trying to get to know us. We would stay at a hotel. But then once they met us and they trust us with their children and with their families, then we were able to even stay at their homes for a weekend or maybe 4 days and just be there and participate with them. We would go to quinceañeras, weddings, I don't know, like celebrations, and just be there with them. The other type of methodology that I was using was ethnography, which was like to write down, describe everything that we were watching and listening and even smelling and seeing, you know, just like using all our senses and trying to describe everything in a diary that we had. And our field notes, of course. And we would do this at homes, at schools, in the community, in the park. Just whenever we had time, we would take notes about everything. And then, like I said, these participant observation, ethnographies, field notes, they were mostly focused on the children. What did the children think and feel about moving from one country to another and going to school in one country and then the other one? What did they feel about their family? If they felt like their family was closer in the United States or in Mexico? What did they feel about, you know, like their parents and their peers and their extended family? So it was mostly about what children thought about it. Now, in 2019, just before the pandemic started, Dr. Zúñiga and Eduardo Carrillo, which is my fieldwork partner, they did some interviews in Nayarit and Jalisco, and with parents exclusively. And while I was at El Colegio de Sonora with Dr. Gloria Siria Valdez, I was meeting some of the parents that were coming from Arizona to Sonora and were enrolling their children in Mexican schools. And at the Research Institute, we also had an after-school program for these children to help them with their math and Spanish and social studies. So all these parents were coming and I was meeting them. So Dr. Zúñiga and I talked to Doctora Gloria and we're like, hey, can we come and interview the moms in Sonora about their experience? So in 2019, 2020, Dr. Zúñiga came to Sonora and we interviewed 5 or 6 moms and dads about their experiences with Mexican schools and with American schools. So it was very recent. We just redacted their stories. We haven't done any analysis. We haven't shared anything. So today I'm going to share mostly from Morelos, not from these other states where we did interviews. So in Morelos, even though I was focused on the children, because I was interacting and staying at these homes for short periods of time, I was able to talk to parents too. So what I'm presenting today is part of that. So here I just have like 3 examples of the type of children that I interviewed in Morelos. These are from 3 different families. Luis, for example, he was born in California. He moved to Morelos when he was 13 years old. Then he moved to Sonora with his parents and his brother and sister when he was about 15 years old. They moved to Sonora because his mom had some family there. And also they wanted to be close to the border with California because in California he had 3 sisters, 3 older sisters who were still in California. So they felt like Sonora was closer to the border. And after a few months, he moved back to California to where his sisters lived. He had a younger brother and a younger sister with him when they moved to Mexico. Now, Enrique, he was born in Chicago and he moved to Morelos too when he was 12. Then he moved with his mom, his dad, and his youngest brother. His older brother stayed in Chicago. And then after 2 years, he moved back to Chicago. And I'll talk about a little bit more about their experience in a little bit. But he moved back to Chicago. Then he moved for a little bit to Texas. And then now he's back in Chicago. He's been there for 4 years now. And then Beto, he is a different student. He was actually born in Morelos, but he moved to California when he was 1 year old. So his whole school experience was done in California. Like, he started school in California. And then when he was 13 years old, they moved back to Morelos, and he's still in Morelos. Okay, so the first two were born in the US and came to Mexico for the first time and then moved back to the US. And Beto was born in Mexico, went to the US, and came back to Mexico. So we have 2 or 3 different types of migrant students in our research, okay? However, if we're talking about parents are all born in Mexico. They came to the US mostly illegally. Yes, I don't recall any that was here legally. They had their children. Some of them brought their children who were born in Mexico, but most of them, they had their children here in the US and then went back to Mexico and brought their children to Mexico for the first time. So I wanted to organize this PowerPoint in a way where I could talk about their different experiences. So the way that we see the trajectories of these families is by how their children start school and then where they go to school and then whether they move to Mexico or they move back to the US and then what they do. So I wanted to present this information in a way where you can kind of visualize what the parent is going through from the moment he leaves either Mexico or the US. And when we talk to parents and we ask them, what's the reason why you moved to the US, or what's the reason why you moved to Mexico, the first thing that most of them say is, it's because of my children. So I guess this was kind of the right way to present this information, because most of their migration process, most of their migratory trajectory is based upon what it is best for their children, school-wise. So some of the steps or some of the process that parents take to enroll children in schools, that's very significant for these migrant families. So first, they start asking for information in the community, whether they are coming from Mexico or going to Mexico. They start building a network of family, of friends. Maybe nowadays they use a little bit more Facebook and social media to start getting to know the community they're going to go into. Then, as soon as they get to one community or the other, either in the US or in Mexico, they want to go and find a school for their children. So I want you to keep in mind that, and I'm talking about the 6 families that I interviewed. From the 6 families that I interviewed, 5 of the 6, the parents, they only finished elementary school. The other one, they went up to high school. That's it. So for these families, it's very important that their children are in school, that their children succeed in school, that their children do something more than what they did. So these parents are the ones that are thinking that their children will be the first generation that will finish middle school, high school, that maybe will go to college, maybe will have a higher degree. So that is one of the main reasons why they moved to the US. They wanted their children to have a best life, or that's why they themselves moved to the US, because they wanted to have a better life and they wanted their children in the future to have a better life. And then then they have this period of time, right, where their children are already enrolled in the school. And I'm going to talk about how they experience school as parents. And then they also have these life outside of school, right? When their children come from school or on the weekends, how they feel, how they do parenting. And then let me see, from the 6, all of the 6 families, their children were removed from school at some point, either in the US or in Mexico. So I just wanted to talk about these steps. And in order to do this, I'm going to do it the ethnographic way. I'm going to be reading some parts of the interviews so that you have a better idea of what they are thinking and how they're feeling. And then I can explain a little bit about the context of these quotes. And then at the end, we can have like a final reflection. So asking for information. So in the US, they feel like going to school and finding a school is really easy, even if they don't speak English. For example, Claudia, she said, I actually didn't have a problem finding a school when Beto and I joined my husband in California. I didn't know anyone here, but I went to the school closest to our home. So Claudia moved to California 1 year after her husband. She didn't speak any English. She just went for it. She was tired of being by herself in Mexico with their son. So they saved money for her to come illegally with her son and cross the border. So she says that finding a school and asking for information, it's not hard, even if you don't have a network of friends or family. However, Mari, for example, tells us that in Mexico, give me 1 second because I cannot see there we go. That in Mexico, I hadn't been in Mexico in so long that I had to call my sister and ask her what to bring, like documents and stuff for my sons to go to school over there. I had their transcripts ready and all. Still, it was hard to communicate with the school. They didn't have a website or a phone number listed, so I just had to wing it and go with what I had. So they feel like in Mexico, they do need a network of friends, of family, because most of the parents, they would tell me, in the US, schools, even the elementary school, even the pre-K school, they have a website. They have like a picture of the principal and the teachers, and they have the phone number and email, and you can just call and they'll answer. In Mexico, they don't have that. They're not as advanced, in some schools, especially in the areas where they came back in Morelos. So they feel like in Mexico, they do need this network to be able to know a little bit more about the schools. Now, their first interactions in schools. Again, Claudia, who brought Beto from Mexico to the United States, she told us Beto had his first school experience there. He started preschool in California. I can say his transition was very easy. We spoke Spanish all the time at home, so I was scared that he wouldn't understand. But they had a program where they were teaching Spanish as a second language. So the teacher spoke Spanish, not as fluent, but I could understand her, and that's why it was easy for him to go to school. As for the papers, I think they only asked for his birth certificate. So Claudia, who didn't speak English, who was new in the city, who didn't have a network, she was still able to take her son to the school, to the preschool, and find a teacher that spoke Spanish because it's California, right? And they only asked for his birth certificate. So that was very easy for her. And because of the teacher knowing Spanish, Beto transitioned really easily because he was used to speaking and listening to Spanish at home. So coming to a school that had a Spanish program was very useful. Now in Mexico, Mari told us, the first time I went to school here, I felt hopeless. The principal was not there, and the secretary told me that I needed more documents, and they wouldn't let my sons go there until I had them. We came here without planning, following my husband after he was deported. I didn't have all of my son's things. Luckily, my daughters are in California and were able to send me what I needed, but it took about 2 months for them to be able to go to school. And this is unfortunately the truth in most of the states in Mexico. And that's why we're doing a lot of workshops with principals and teachers and just like people in the educational system in general, because there is a law that says that children are supposed to go to school from the moment they arrive to the school, but not a lot of principals and teachers know about it, or they know about it, but they don't remember about it. We don't know. The thing is that it takes children up to 6 months, up to 5 months to be enrolled in schools, because principals say, oh, well, they didn't come when the school year started. But if these are deported families, of course, they don't have a date, you know, to be deported. They just get deported, and it doesn't matter what day it is or what month, they just get deported. So we have been trying to educate teachers and principals about this and telling them, you know, just because this happened to this family doesn't mean that the child should stay at home and not go to school all these days and months. So we're still working on that with schools in different states, and it's getting better, but we still have a lot of work to do. Now, the experience in the schools. In the US, Rosa told us, my sons were top students in the US. They were both football and soccer players. Over there, you have to have good grades to be on the teams, and they were always on top of their grades. Luis was also in the band. As a mom, I felt good that my children were doing good. We also had meetings with the teachers, and they would try to include as much as they could. For example, on Cinco de Mayo, they would ask the Mexican Latina moms to bring some food or a piñata or a snack, and we would stay and share together. So parents in the US, they recognize that in the US, they feel useful, that they feel like the teachers and the school try to incorporate them so that their children can succeed in school. In Mexico, though, they said, well, I mean, there are good teachers here. I wish they were just a bit more patient. Also, I feel like over here, they don't like parents coming to the school. Over there in the US, I would go to the school for meetings or gatherings or to see my children play a sport. Over here, I am scared of getting a phone call from the school. They call you when your son does something wrong. At the beginning, they will call me almost every day, and I would be there. And it was always the same. I stopped going at some point. So the parents, they realized that the educational system in Mexico is different. You know, in Mexico, it's a bit different how we try to correct things with students and at school. So they feel like, oh, they're just gonna call me to tell me that my son did something wrong, instead of being happy that they get a phone call from school so that they can get involved with their children. So that was something that we saw that was recurring with all the families. About staying in school, in the US, they felt like staying in school was easy. Like Mari said, the schools in the district are like connected, I guess. She didn't know how they were connected, but she said that they were connected. Like if your son or daughter goes in the middle school in your neighborhood, he or she already has a place in the high school. When we left California, we didn't tell anyone, and the school year started. Well, my daughters, they got a few phone calls from the high school asking where their brothers were. They had to tell them they were in Mexico with me. So In the US, they feel like there is a system of following up with students, and that's why it's easier to stay in school, at least until high school. But in Mexico, Claudia told us it was so hard for Beto to stay in school. Sometimes it was the principal and the teacher. Sometimes it was timing, like when we were late to enroll him because the middle school didn't give us his documents on time. Other times it was that we didn't have the money. You know, my husband and I only finished elementary school and we wanted Beto to go to high school and maybe college, but it just gets really hard. He had to stay here with us and do nothing for a year before we could enroll him again. That's another thing that unfortunately is happening in Mexico. We don't have a way to give a follow-up to all these students that are coming to Mexican schools. For example, these 6 families that I followed, only one family, they moved 5 times in the same state within 6 months. If I hadn't been doing this type of work of ethnography and keeping in touch with them through phone and through email, you know, WhatsApp, Facebook, I wouldn't have known where they were the next time I visited Morelos. It was because of this longitudinal study and multi-site study that I was able to know where they were every time I went there. And I knew if the girls would come to California and then go back to Mexico, if they moved to Chicago or back. That was because I was doing this research. But if I wasn't doing this research, I wouldn't have been able to know where they were. And that's the thing. Once we reach them, once we get into school, even Laura, once she types all the information in the computer, okay, she knows for sure that they're in that school. But after a month, after 6 months, are they still in those schools? Where are they? Did they go back to the US? Did they move to another neighborhood within the same city? Did they move to another state in Mexico? And that's something that we cannot even start working still on. So for now, we're focusing on keeping the children in school and trying to train the teachers to be better teachers and to receive them better and to try to integrate the students better. But following up, that's another big challenge that we have in Mexico. And then life outside of school. In the US, this was one of the fathers. He said, you know, it's sad to say, but in the US, I barely saw my daughters. I had 4 jobs, 1 during the day, 1 at night, and 2 on the weekends. My daughters would only see me sleeping. Of course, they had everything and they would go on vacation with their mom, but I never enjoyed any of that. I had to take sleeping pills to get a few hours of sleep and caffeine pills and other stuff to stay awake. I don't miss that kind of life. It was not a healthy life, not a happy life. So these parents, of course, they miss being in the US, being able to provide vacations and housing and cars and all these luxuries for their children. But at the same time, they recognize that in Mexico is where they have connected better with their families, where they can take care of their health, take care of their relationships. And that's for most of the parents. Some of the mothers even said that when they were in the US, they had stress problems, anxiety, their hair was falling, their skin was not looking good. And now that they're in Mexico, they are eating healthier, they feel stronger, they're not depressed anymore. So I know this is not about school, but it has to do with, okay, they move because of their children and they get some of these advantages too of being in Mexico and not feeling stressed, not being overly tired all the time. And then in Mexico, Luis told us, I am sad that I cannot give my sons what they were used to. They each had their own room. We had a few cars at the door. We would go on trips. Yes, I am sad about that and about the fact that here I cannot find a good job. What I am not sad about is that I can spend more time with them and get to know them. I can actually sit down and enjoy my TV and drink coffee while I talk to my wife. Over there, I just didn't have the time. So the same thing. Of course, as adults, they're worried that they cannot provide sufficiently for their family and their children, but at the same time, they are happy that they can connect as parents with their children. And I think this is one of my last slides. But removing transitioning children from schools. So in the US, at the beginning, it's really hard. Just being in the situation of deportation, not all of them were deported. Some of them migrated to Mexico because they wanted their children to learn about the Mexican culture. Others migrated because they started a business in Mexico and they just wanted to move. Others moved, like Beto, they moved because someone was threatening to kill their son. So that's why they moved to Mexico. So there's many reasons why they're moving to Mexico. Not all of them were deported. But for children, it's very hard to leave their friends, to leave their school, to leave their community when they are moving from the US to Mexico at the beginning. So Claudia and Roberto, they were telling us while we were drinking coffee at night, it was really hard and sad to see Beto cry when we told him we wouldn't go back to the US. He thought we were here on vacation in Morelos. The transition was hard on him. He could understand very little Spanish and he couldn't read or write in Spanish. He still tells us all the time that he wants to go back to the US, but we explained to him he couldn't and he just kept crying. So they realize that it is very hard on their children, and that's why they go to schools. They say, okay, school is a safe place. I should take my children to school so that they can adapt better, so that they can learn the language, so that they can find friends. But then they go to the school and nothing like that happens. You know, it takes a while for their children to adjust to a new school, to a new system, to a new language. So it's even hard on parents to listen to their children be sad and cry after school and tell them that they don't have any friends or that they're not understanding the school subjects, etc. So they feel sometimes hopeless because they didn't, if they just went to elementary school, they don't know how to help their children who are in higher grades either. And then in Mexico, Mari told us, my son has been at home for 2 years now. Imagine that. That's actually really sad as a teacher and as a parent. No one ever came to ask if he was okay or to make him go back to school. I don't want him to go back to California with his sisters because he's still too young. I've talked to him about going back to school, but he says that teachers don't like him and that school is hard. So we just let him stay at home. I don't know, maybe if he would go back to the US, he would go back to school. So for Mari, it was easier to remove his son from school than to see him upset and angry that he didn't understand the subjects, that the teachers didn't like him, that he couldn't make friends. So this is one of the, I think, the most extreme cases in the families that I interviewed, where this boy didn't even finish middle school. He was in second grade of secundaria, which is middle school here in Mexico. And until now, he hasn't gone back to school. That was like 5-6 years ago. So at the end, his parents just they just stopped trying. They just let him stay at home. Whenever I would visit, he was playing video games or just in his room. And then I think 2 years ago, he came back to California to be with his sisters and he started working, but he never went back to school. So that's another problem. Like I was telling you, there's no follow-up of these students. There's no follow-up of these families. So it's really hard to figure out what happened to these students, if they stayed in school, if they didn't, and that's it. So for my final thoughts, I guess school should be a place where children interact, where children learn about their community, where children learn language, where children learn other subjects. However, all these ruptures between the family, between the language, in the community, do not allow these children to adjust fully in one country or another. For those like Luis and Enrique who came back to the US, even coming back to the US, even though they were born here, even though they speak the language, even though they grew up here, it was really hard to go back to school. Why? Because there was a gap of 1 or 2 years in Mexico where they didn't go to school. So imagine, what are we doing as teachers, as researchers, as schools to make that gap easier, or not even have a gap between the transition of Mexican and American schools. These are only 2 examples, but I don't know how many other children are going through the same situation. Family, we were very surprised that family-wise, they were very happy. The children that came back to the US by themselves, they told us that they were more connected with their parents than when they lived in the US and they had never been to Mexico. They felt like in Mexico, they learned to appreciate their parents. They learned to appreciate the work that they did. And the parents, they felt like they were able to spend more time with their children, more time to get to know them, more time to share with them and teach them about the Mexican culture and all the things that they did to have their family together in both countries. And community-wise, children feel like in Mexico, they had a better community. They felt more free to play and to go out at night. They didn't feel as afraid. But parents, they feel as in Mexico, their community is broken. They feel like when they come back from the US to Mexico, their family is not welcoming to them. So parents are always struggling to find jobs, to find a place to live, and also to connect with their families, extended families in Mexico. They feel that when they were in the US, because they were able to send money and gifts and, you know, like just be able to provide for their families in Mexico, that their family liked them. But now that they're in Mexico, that they don't have a job, that they're struggling, they feel like their family doesn't like them anymore. So it's kind of hard, you know, to go and interview these families about these too. And then circular migration. Like I said, all of these parents, they are not American citizens. Some of their children are. So children can go back and forth between the United States and Mexico. Some of them, you know, they come and work and then they go visit their parents. But parents, they have to stay in Mexico. I've heard about 2 cases where they have been trying to come back to the US, but they say that now it's harder. So they stay in Mexico and they try to survive, and they try to make a life over there. There is one family, they're doing really well. The dad is like an entrepreneur. He started a building company in Sonora. And he just sold everything they had in California and started his company in Sonora. But the other families, they're not doing so well economically and financially. So I don't know if you have any other questions, but this was my presentation on what parents think about their children's experiences in the schools in Mexico and the United States. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Betsabé González, for such a wonderful presentation and for sharing your research on these experiences of parents. And this is the moment that we welcome comments, questions. Please feel free to send it. You can write them in Spanish as well in the chat box. So one of the questions that comes up in this types of conversation, it's what are some of the solutions that are being discussed? You mentioned early on in your presentation that there were several meetings with administrators, especially in Mexico, which is kind of surprising because sometimes, you know, there's this idea that because it's in Mexico, there's no language barrier in communicating with administrators. But yeah, the research shows that there are other challenges that comes in enrolling their children in schools. And therefore, language is not the barrier. Did I understand that right? I guess that's more of a question comment, but in terms about what's being done or what are some of the solutions for this challenges that parents have, especially in the school setting in Mexico, because it seems like there's more issues over there than here in the US?
Yeah, so the thing is that it's not lack of communication, it's just that from 2011, 2012, when there was a lot of migration from the United States to Mexico. Before that, there were some states in Mexico that had circular migration. It was very common. But after 2011, 2012, they started coming to other states in Mexico that were not commonly known as migrant receivers. So in these schools, they had never seen migrant students before. They had never seen students speaking another language. So it was hard for teachers to understand, like, you look Mexican, how can you not speak Spanish? How can you not understand what I'm saying? How can you not know the history of Mexico? And so it has been our job to go to these schools and tell teachers, you know, this is not a student that doesn't know something or it's not capable of being in this grade. It's just a student that was raised in another country, that was taught in another language, that was taught another type of history. And you need to understand that and be more patient so that he can start understanding Spanish, so that he can start learning about the Mexican history and so on. So the things that we've been doing is until probably 2019, we were still doing research. We were still doing these interviews. We would gather teachers and principals in schools and let them ask us, you know, what questions they had, how could we help. But now we are trying to work with Secretaría de Educación Pública, which is like the general office in each of the states. And we tell them, hey, here's 5, 6 of us that know about this topic. Why don't you gather all your teachers, all your principals, and let's give you some workshops, and let's give you some ideas on how you can integrate these students. Let's give you some documents that you can read in Spanish or English. Let's help you connect with teachers and principals in the US so that you guys can work together and become better at these transitions with students. So that's what we're trying to do. And also in other, for example, Doctora Gloria in Sonora, she has been working closely with the government to pass, you know, some laws where it is more clear that children have to go to school, that children should be allowed in schools as soon as they get as soon as they go and ask for information. So it was already there, the law, but now we're trying to make it bigger. We're trying to, you know, just like make it explode so that more people know about it and that these children can actually go to school and transition better. Mm-hmm. So very small steps, but we're trying.
Yes, well, thank you. So I have another question. So you mentioned that many of the students were born in the US, have US citizenship. Is that an issue in enrollment in Mexico? because, or how does that work in Mexico? Do they need dual citizenship to have priority in enrollment? Or why is it so challenging for them to enroll?
So it shouldn't be an issue, because just like I said, there is a law that says that no matter the citizenship, no matter if the children don't bring any documents with them, no matter if they don't have birth certificate or anything that says whether they're Mexican or not, they should be enrolled in school the moment that their parents go to the school and ask for information. There shouldn't be an issue. The issue is that principals and teachers, they're not equipped to know what to do with them. So there's a lack of information between Secretaría de Educación Pública and the schools to let them know, hey, just bring them in and then we'll help you with all the documentation. So most principals, they are asking, oh no, if you don't bring me the transcripts translated in Spanish, then I won't let your child in. If you don't bring me a dual citizenship birth certificate, then I won't let you come in. If you don't, so they just keep asking for more documents that they shouldn't ask. So yeah, so there shouldn't be an issue. There's a law already that says that they should be in school already, and it's getting better now. These interviews, like I said, are from 2012, 2016. Now there's more information out there and we're trying to work more, but yeah, there shouldn't be an issue. It doesn't matter if they have a dual citizenship or not. They have to go to school. They can be enrolled in schools. I think it's mostly the mentality of some principals and some teachers about something new in their school, something different, and they just don't know how to deal with it. Like we have some teachers that tell us, well, I never heard about this. I never learned about this when I was studying to be a teacher. So I don't know how to deal with a child that doesn't speak Spanish. I don't know how to deal with a child that speaks only sign language. There was even a case in Sonora where there was a transnational student who spoke American Sign Language. So imagine, he couldn't even speak fluently and he was speaking sign language in another language. So if that student comes to my classroom, I don't even know sign language in Spanish, you know? So it's just a lot of things. Teachers also tell us, you know, like there's so much going on in my day already. I already have one of the difference between schools in Mexico and the US. In the US, there's probably like most 25, 30 students in the classroom. In Mexico, we have 60, we have 70. So imagine the lot of work of the teacher. They feel like having an extra student that doesn't speak the language, that doesn't know the subjects. It's more work for them. So sometimes that's also the situation where the teacher doesn't know what to do and doesn't want to do more work either.
Well, thank you so much for sharing. I know we're getting close to the end of our session, but I don't have any questions for that from the audience, but I wanted to ask you if there's any like ending comments that you would like to end or highlight. I know you went through so many, you provided so much great content, especially sharing your story and how that connected to your research. I wonder like if there's any like, because you been on this research for such a long time with these students, how does that, how have you noticed any changes from when you started from now towards the end?
Yes, I think that now with social media, you know, and more ways of communicating, we have been able to connect teachers from both sides of the border to help students and families that are crossing back and forth. When I was 12 years old and I was in Cleveland, we didn't have that. We didn't have a community that could help us. and that could help my parents and my sister and I to transition from one country to another. Now there's a lot of community, especially here in California. There's always conversations between teachers on this side and teachers in Tijuana that are always talking, you know, about how they can become better and how they can learn from each other. So I think that teachers, especially here in California, are doing a great job at that, at wanting to learn and wanting to share what they're doing to be better schools, to have better classrooms. And I don't know, but like the families that we interviewed that were coming from California, they had so many good things to say about schools in California and how they're well prepared and how they love that their children were here and that they were able to learn and live in a place where teachers and schools actually care for their children. So we hope that that is the same in other states in the US, and that is the same in other states in Mexico. Of course, in Mexico, in the major states where we've been doing research, Morelos, Sonora, Baja California, Monterrey, now we just had training in November with teachers in Monterrey. They are getting there. They are getting there, and like we're really happy that from our research, we are now able to give back through these workshops and through these presentations so that more people are teaming up with us on this topic.
Well, thank you so much. And for great responses. I do have like a few more comments that just came in. I just read them to acknowledge them. So the first one, it's a common question from Ali Niano. Thank you so much, Professor Román González, for this amazing research. Let's hope that there will be more support for research on the education experiences of transnational families. I was wondering if there are still requirements that Mexican children pay for their own school supplies, books, uniforms, and such. This was a common comment I heard from Mexican parents I work with in the US, that they had to abandon their school in Mexico because their parents couldn't pay. Is this still the case? If not, when did that law change?
So yeah, that's very common, and like I read in one of the slides, right? Sometimes it's the money that they don't have, because some parents were like, here they have to wear 3 uniforms, one for sports, one for the day of the flag, and one for the rest of the week. And we don't have the money. We have 3 children, so we have to buy 9 uniforms. And if they don't wear a uniform, they cannot go into school. So yeah, those things are still there. I guess in just like really small communities, like rural communities, maybe the school is sponsored and they might get some free uniforms or free books. In public schools, everybody gets free books, but other than that, school supplies, uniforms, that has to be provided by the parents. That's still the case. There's other schools where they even have to pay like a yearly fee to keep the school, you know, like to paint the school or to clean the school, things like that. So yeah, it becomes a burden sometimes for these parents, especially because they come to a place where they don't find a job, where they don't have a house, where they don't have a network of family that wants to support them. So it's really hard for them to keep their children in school. So that personally, I've been trying to help on that, but that's outside of my research. That's me as a person, that I try to donate things or send to nonprofit organizations that help these kind of children, but it's not something that it's done very often, you know.
Thank you. And there's one last question, which I think is a good question to end. This one is coming from Jacqueline Chaboya. What do you recommend to migrant students today to be successful?
Well, I think having a community with parents, teachers, principals, and the students, that's gonna help the student be successful. When the student starts thinking that he's not welcome, that he's not good enough, that he or she is not loved or part of the community, then that's when he or she starts blocking, you know, like themselves. The children that I interview, they remember the teachers that did something good for them. They remember the first boy or girl that smiled at them and that told them, oh, here's my book, or you can copy the homework from my notebook. You know, they remember the teacher that stopped the class and gave them their books so that they could continue with the dictation. But they also remember the really bad teachers. They also remember the really bad peer that said something mean to them. They also remember the really bad experience. So I think if we have a really respectful community, a really welcoming community in our schools, in our classrooms, that's going to help these students succeed in any situation.